Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. So here's a very interesting story about something that is quite tragic, although in the end, not necessarily that tragic. So here it is, it's how an indie dev made $4 million, that's insane, and then goes broke. See if that sounds really bad? Nowadays, finding success with indie games is insanely difficult. Most games don't find success at all. If we look at the stats on Steam for indie games, we can see that literally over 50%, so 56% don't even make $1,000. Then a handful more make between 1 and 5,000, then between 5 and 10,000, so about 75% make less than $10,000 per each game. And only a small sliver makes a giant amount, and really only 2.6% made over $1 million. That's on the entirety of Steam. So that is in total 74,000 games. All put together, the median revenue is $500. So yeah, finding success in this industry is quite insane. So this story over here obviously is quite tragic because one developer that did find insane success, $4 million, that's a huge hit, but then goes broke. So yeah, let's see how exactly did this happen. Like I wrote here, so yeah, finding success with indie games is insanely difficult. Most games make nothing. So imagine you do find success, you get to the top 1% of Steam with a hit game and make $4 million. But then 3 years later, you sell your IP for a measly $5K. That's the story of the dev behind Rise of Industry, a hit automation game from 2019. So here's the game. It's a real interesting game. I've had this one on my wishlist for many years. This one came out all the way back in 2019. It has 3,000 reviews, 74% positive. Definitely a very interesting game. This is an automation management sort of game. You basically build a city and then have to manage all of the various production lines. So definitely the kind of game that does very well on Steam. And again, this one did extremely well, $4 million. That's an insane success. We can see this had a developer and then also had a publisher. So the dev has put out a great YouTube video talking about that story, how the game found a lot of success before Steam, then got a somewhat bad publishing deal, launched on Steam and made millions. Yep, that's the story on this video. So I really recommend you watch this whole video. The way he talks about the experience is very interesting. And then down here in the comments, there's also, he posts a bit more explanation on some more details on this story. But yeah, so the game launched on Steam and made millions. So far so good. However, then they overexpand the team to over 20 people. And this right here, when I heard this in video, that's basically when warning lights came upon my head. Hiring 20 people, that's an insane amount of people, meaning it's an insane amount of cost. Just the other day, I was doing a live stream and someone actually asked me a relatively similar question. Basically, if I got $10 million, what would I do? Would I make more games? Would I make a studio? Or would I retire? And basically what I said is, first of all, I wouldn't retire just because I can't imagine myself not doing anything. But then I also said I would no way build a studio exactly because of this. This right here, this terrifies me. Having a team of over 20 people that you need to take care of, that is insanely scary. And actually this whole story is kind of a cautionary tale on how that can go so terribly bad. In case you never thought about it, 20 people is actually an insane amount of people, especially for an indie studio. If you're talking about AAA, then sure, those usually have hundreds or thousands of developers. But in indie, usually it's something like a team of either a sole developer, 1 to 2, 3, 4 people. And then on like, let's say AAA indie studios, on studios like Supergiant Games that made Hades, this one they make tons of very successful games, and over here they've got 25 employees. So I really just want to put in context just how big that number 20 is. It might sound small if all you think about is really just AAA devs, but for indie developers, a studio of 20 people, that is an insane amount. But anyway, so continuing here, so like I said, however, they expanded their team to over 20 people due to one very incorrect assumption, assuming that the game would continue selling the same number of copies month over month. And this right here is a very dangerous and, for the most part, very incorrect assumption. Usually games, they sell a lot as soon as they launch on their first month, and then those sales basically dwindle down. That is the natural curve for pretty much every single game. There are very few exceptions. So for the most part, you sell a lot at launch, then it goes down, maybe you do some kind of sale, bumps it up a bit, but never higher than that one. Then goes down again, maybe do a daily deal, maybe that's an even bigger bump, but again, continues going on the slow down trend. For example, this right here is very rare. So this is Project Zomboid. It originally came out in 2013 or something like that. And the game was successful, but this one, as you can see, the success has actually been building upon itself. It is growing year by year. And over here, it's basically when they made the multiplayer update. So when this game went multiplayer, it basically exploded and just sold insane amounts of copies. So for this game, they are indeed selling quite a lot more now, which is literally on year 10 of development. They're selling quite a lot more now than on the first year when they launched. But again, that is very much the exception and not the rule at all. Most games are kind of like this. So this is BattleBit Remastered. This was a massive mega hit. This was a huge game. Definitely very successful. Lots of people, lots of players. And over here you can see release. It pretty much blew up on the charts, blew up on the records. But then, of course, it goes down slowly. Then when they do some kind of update, or in this case, a free weekend, goes up, goes down, do some sales, goes up, down, and so on. So for the most part, the trend is going down with slight bumps. And this is exactly representative of pretty much every single game. Launch a lot, then go down. So this right here, this assumption, this one is a very incorrect and very dangerous assumption. And that's actually basically why this story ended up with a pretty bad result. It is basically because they overexpand the team based on how much they made on that very first month. But then again, if on the first month you make this, then make this, and so on. But if you hire people that requires this, then when the revenue kind of goes down, you kind of go more and more deep in the red. So yeah, make sure you never do this assumption. Maybe one day you get lucky. Maybe you win the lottery. Maybe you launch some kind of game that sells a little bit on month one, and for some reason, 1 year later sells a lot more. But just remember, that is not going to happen. Likely not going to happen. That is not normal. The normal thing is sell a lot, then go down slowly over time. There are very, very few games where they keep selling more and more over time. Most games sell a lot at launch, and then the sales dwindle over time. So if you expand your team based on your month one sales, then you will likely end up in this scenario having 20 developers working on the game and dwindling funds from which to pay them. So yeah, this really is the part that when I heard this in the video, I was, okay, I can see how this happens. I can see how you can make $4 million and then lose it all. And the answer is just like this, overexpansion. Like I said, this is one of my biggest fears. This is why I will never, ever have a game studio. I'm a big fan of working just by myself with some freelance artists and so on. But yeah, having a studio and being responsible, especially for 20 people, that is an insane amount of people. That sounds insane. And again, becomes super high risk where even if you have such an insane hit, $4 million, that's a huge hit. But even with that, if you have 20 people to pay, that does not last very long. In case you don't know the rough math for how to hire someone. So these developers, I believe they were European. So let's say over here in Europe, the average developer salary is something like 30, 40K, something like that. So you start with something like 30,000. Then of course you got all kinds of taxes, all kinds of company expense on that. So usually the rough rule is basically double it. So that is basically how much an employee is going to cost the company. So if each employee costs 60K and you got 20 people you need to pay, that means you've got 1.2 million you need to come up with every single year just to keep those 20 people employed. So when you look at it from that point of view, and you compare it to $4 million, and all of a sudden that doesn't seem like that much. So continuing, so they attempted updates to get the game selling more, but like it happens in most games, the sales numbers continue their slow downtrend, slowly eating away at the company's funds until there was basically nothing left. At the end, the lead developer was even at risk of losing his house and ended up taking a pretty bad deal to sell the IP for a measly 5K. So yeah, as you can see, based on the numbers, $4 million sounds like an insane amount of money, and it is for just one person, but for a studio of 20 people, that very quickly goes away. In the video, he talks about how the company account by 2020 had negative 100 grand in the bank, then by 2021 had negative 140 grand in the bank. So yeah, it's because of this that I'm assuming that he took some kind of personal loans trying to keep the company afloat, but then of course those loans have to be paid for. So I'm guessing that is the reason as to why at some point he was at a risk of losing his own house. At that point, yeah, he just took a pretty bad deal to sell the IP for a measly 5K. So just think about that. You make a game, it generates $4 million. That is very successful, very valuable. But at the end, through desperation, you basically sell that IP for just 5K. Although to be fair, he did write the comments a bit more about it. So here in the comments, someone asked, why sell for 5K? What did 5K possibly have bought you? For 5K for that amount, really just borrow it from an uncle. To which he replied, so 5K for the IP, and to sweeten the deal, got 45K from advanced sales. So it wasn't just 5K, 5 plus 45, so 50K. So like he says here, I need the cash urgently or I'd lose the house. So that's basically negotiation 101. Never put yourself in a position where you are desperate to make a deal with someone, because it happened something like this, where the publisher pretty much took advantage of him. He was desperate, so yeah, selling 5K, that is a very low amount for an IP that had already generated over $4 million. And then perhaps even more important than money is how he also talks about the personal cost. Being under so much stress for so long, working nonstop is a recipe for guaranteed burnout, which is what happened. And yep, in the video, he basically talks about that, at some point he was having constant panic attacks, constant hospital visits. This level of stress is definitely not sustainable. Stress is definitely a killer. It's definitely a very bad thing. Honestly, that is something that I myself am constantly looking for, constantly making sure I'm not getting way too stressed, because I very much want to continue doing this for the next 50, 60, 80 years. And I know the only way I can do that is if I keep myself calm so I don't burn out, so I don't go insane. So yeah, the personal cost can definitely be much more costly than the actual financial cost. So if you don't take care of yourself, let me just remind you to do take care of yourself. Don't just work 24/7. If you do, you won't burn out and it will be very, very bad, so don't do that. That is why I make it a habit to work out, to go on runs, to walk my dogs, because if I don't do that, then yep, I would definitely burn out. However, and here's the interesting part, while this seems like a tragic story, that is not necessarily the case. Basically, the money didn't really vanish into thin air. It was paid to developers working on the game. So a bunch of developers got paid a nice amount whilst working on a game for a few years, rather than just a single developer becoming a multimillionaire, so that is still a positive outcome. So I'd say this right here is the positive of this story. That money didn't really just vanish into thin air. It was paid as wages to developers. It's not like he got those $4 million and just gambled them away and just wasted it all. No, it was paid to 20 developers. So it really sucks how he could have been set for life and he's not. But on the other hand, a bunch of developers got a bunch of money for working on games for at least a small amount of time. So the headline definitely sounds like a tragic story, and it's definitely tragic for that one developer, especially by going through that personal cost, all that stress. That is very tragic. But on the other hand, a game found lots of success. That success was paid to a bunch of developers. So in that sense, it still ended up nicely. And if you're curious what happened to the publisher as soon as they bought the IP for just those measly 5K, in the video he talks about how right after signing away the IP, they started making a bunch of bundles, and obviously since he sold it, then he didn't see 1 cent of it. So for the publisher, that was probably a great deal. I would say an exploitative deal, but sure, definitely a good deal on their end. They bought the IP for a very cheap amount, and they probably recouped that cost within like 1 or 2 months. And then since they had the IP, they tried actually making a sequel, but according to the developer, they didn't listen to him at all, they didn't want him involved in the sequel at all, so they basically just farmed it out to some kind of developer that probably didn't understand the genre or what made the original game popular. So the end result is the game has just 100 reviews, makes 59%. So yeah, based on this, I would say the rise of industry IP is probably dead. I haven't played the game myself, so I don't know why exactly it's mixed, but this is probably one of those scenarios where some kind of studio is contracted to make some kind of game, and they really have no passion for the genre, the game idea, nothing like that, so they really just make a game. And if the developer behind isn't really all that interested in making a game, they really just build a product and that's it, which ends up just like this, so 100 mixed reviews. Then at the end, like I wrote here, so I find this story to be a fascinating cautionary tale on the dangers of overexpansion. Personally, I am pretty risk averse, which I am, definitely. So like I wrote here, which might seem strange due to my choice of job, but it is true. And it is true, I am definitely very risk averse. Which again, might not seem like, considering how I have basically 2 jobs that are considered very, very risky. In the game development and YouTube, those are 2 things that if you have kids and you want your kids to be stable in life, you would never recommend any of those jobs. Do not be an indie game developer, do not be a YouTuber. Those are 2 very risky, very tough jobs. However, it definitely still matches up with what I say here, how I am very risk averse. That is because I did start making games, so I did become an indie game developer. That did become my job, and it was my sole job for about 7 years before I started this channel. But the way that I made very risk averse was basically I started making games. I was making Flash games for about 5 years. For all that time, I was just living with my parents, so I was not relying on my games to make a living. I was living on my parents' house. They would pay for the food, they would pay for all those things, so I didn't really have any costs. And only after I made games onto Steam and I found quite a decent amount of success, only after I had about 20 grand in the bank, which would have paid for my life for about 3 years, only at that point did I actually feel comfortable enough, okay, I'm going to move out of my parents' house, start paying my own things. I've got 3 years worth of runway, so I think that should be enough for me to make another game and hopefully find success. So yep, I definitely did in-game development in the most risk-free way possible. And same thing over here on YouTube. I only started this YouTube channel once I had pretty nice amount of savings. I've always been in the habit of saving my money. I never really spend way too much. So as I was making my games for about 7-8 years, a lot of the money that I made I didn't really spend it. I really just kept it in the bank. So when I started YouTube, I had a nice amount of change that even if YouTube really failed, even if I stopped making money, I still had more than enough savings to last me for a few years. And it's good that I had that, considering how on YouTube it took me basically 2 years before this channel started making literally any money whatsoever. It took me 20 months before I got my first paycheck from YouTube. So yeah, it was very good that I had those savings, so I was able to basically do YouTube once again on the most risk-free way. I did that and then started making money, and now thankfully I'm doing quite nicely. So yeah, it might seem strange how I say here how I am pretty risk averse, but I definitely am. Anyways, so the thought of expanding into a studio with a dozen developers that I need to pay is one of the scariest things I can think of. That is why even if I had a mega hit and got 10 million bank, I would still be mainly a solo dev working alongside freelancers. And if that very much is the case, I cannot imagine being responsible for like 12 people, a dozen people that are depending on me to pay their life, to buy their house, buy their food. That is an insane amount of responsibility. I really do not want that. So yep, if I got $10 million, then yeah, I guess that is what I would do. Basically the same thing that I'm doing right now, just contracting more with artists, sound designers, and so on. But yeah, hiring a studio where I'm responsible for all those people, that sounds super scary, so I really don't think I would ever do that. So over here, this story is really a cautionary tale of that. So they made a game, the game was insanely successful, really awesome, but then they overexpanded, they hired a team of 20 people, that is a giant army, and keeping all those people paid, that is basically what took these $4 million all the way down to zero. So yeah, this was a fascinating story to hear about. Definitely go ahead and watch the original video so you can hear from the developer themselves. I hope you also find this level of success, making $4 million, but I hope you don't commit these mistakes so you don't end up taking those 4 million and ending up down at zero. By the way, I wrote about this in my Game Dev Report newsletter. This is what I write every single week with the latest game dev news and any interesting articles that I come across every single week. There's a new issue published every Sunday. You can sign up for free, so check it out through the link in the description. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.